introduction of this great initiative. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pumza. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Bede Shepherd, and as Pumza mentioned, I work with Human Rights Watch in our Children's Rights Division, and I'm based in Poland. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you today about this really exciting initiative to explore strengthening the right to education under international law. And I just want to start by reassuring you from the outset that although we'll be talking about international law today, you won't need to be a lawyer or an expert on international human rights to be able to follow along. I promise that this won't be some highly technical legal discussion. I'm going to use my short time today to provide some background to this initiative. Then Mercedes from OMEC, which is the World Organization for Early Childhood Education, will go a little deeper into the need to strengthen international law around early childhood education. And then my colleague Joe Becker will share some of the progress that we've been making of late and where we hope to head next. So for background, a number of different groups have come together on this issue from a variety of different starting points. For example, Mercedes, who is speaking next, and her organization, OMEC, along with a network of civil society organizations in Latin America that work on the right to education, began raising the need to improve international law around the right to education back in 2019. They concluded that the legally binding human rights framework was failing to adequately specify that the right to education should begin in early childhood before primary school. Then UNESCO, which is the UN's education experts, began questioning in 2021 whether the right to education should be reframed in light of 21st century trends and challenges. But for us at Human Rights Watch, which is the organization where I work, oh, have you lost me? No? For us at Human Rights Watch, things really began to come to a fore during all the devastation that was caused to children's education worldwide during the COVID pandemic, which really caused us to take a step back and consider the bigger picture about what was happening to children's education in the world. And we were reflecting that we've really made a lot of progress in the last decades in getting children into primary school and completing primary school. But when it comes to pre-primary education and secondary education, we still have a long way to go. Globally, less than half of young people complete secondary school, and nearly half of all preschool aged are not enrolled in early childhood education. But you all already know these grim statistics. You see them every day. And yet, there's a little bit of noise, maybe from Karine.
Karine, please mute yourself, please.
Wonderful, thank you. But as you all know far better than me, pre-primary and secondary education is so crucial for children's development, their health, and their self-betterment. And if children aren't benefiting from a pre-primary education, and if children aren't benefiting from a pre-primary education and a secondary education, as well as a primary education, then they're really not being equipped.
Karine, please mute yourself. Osama, please. Thank you.
Let's try this. So if kids aren't getting a pre-primary education and a secondary education, then we're really not equipping them to thrive in today's world, or to face today's challenges, or to be able to contribute to their communities and families. And when we looked at the research that Human Rights Watch had done in different countries around the world over the last decade, we saw that the cost of education, tuition, fees, continues to be a major barrier keeping many children from school. And that's in particular during pre-primary education and secondary education. Now, most of you will have heard of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the main source of children's international human rights. The Convention on the Rights of the Child guarantees all children free and compulsory primary education. But what caught our attention was that this Convention on the Rights of the Child says nothing explicit about children having a right to early childhood education, nothing explicit about pre-primary education, let alone that there should be free pre-primary education. And it also doesn't oblige countries to make secondary education free for all children. And, maybe that's not surprising. When the Convention on the Rights of the Child was written more than 30 years ago now, even the idea of free primary education was aspirational for some countries. But now we know today that primary education alone, free primary education alone, is insufficient. And so that's how we at Human Rights Watch arrived at the same place as others were, asking, well, what if we could change international law? How could we make early childhood education an explicit, clear right for all children under international law? What might be the benefits of doing that? And what if international law could guarantee all children free education from pre-primary through secondary? So first, let's talk about how we could change it. How could we make it clear under international law that free education is every child's right from pre-primary through secondary? Well, we at Human Rights Watch believe that the strongest and most efficient way to do this would be through a new treaty. As many of you know, a treaty is sort of like a contract. But whereas a contract is made perhaps between two people or between you and a company, say your telephone or internet provider, that contains legally binding provisions that both sides must follow, a treaty is an agreement between countries where they are legally obliged to follow the provisions within. One example of a treaty that I've already mentioned is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a treaty that every country on the planet, with the exception of the United States, has bound itself to follow. One thing that I find interesting about the Convention on the Rights of the Child is that since it was agreed upon back in 1989, there have been 3 new treaties that have sought to improve upon or upgrade or update the original treaty. And these new treaties have sought to increase the protections for children. These new treaties are known as optional protocols. And one of these optional protocols raised the age at which children could be sent to fight in war. And that was because there was a sense that the original treaty had set the age too low when it had set it at just 15 years old. A second optional protocol went into more details about what countries should do to protect children from sexual exploitation, because it was felt that the original Convention on the Rights of the Child just wasn't clear enough about what countries should be doing. And a third optional protocol gave children the option to make a complaint to an international committee if they feel that their rights are being violated in their home countries. And that was because it was felt that the original Convention on the Rights of the Child was not adequately giving children an opportunity to ask for their rights to be enforced. So this could be a similar case. It's Human Rights Watch's position that the original treaty, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, created more than 34 years ago in admittedly different times, simply set the definition of the right to education too low, too unambitiously. And so a fourth optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child could fix this by explicitly saying that the right to education includes a right to early childhood education and guaranteeing at least 1 year of free pre-primary education, as well as free secondary education for every child. Now, getting a new treaty is not easy. It takes years. I'll give you some examples. The process for the first 2 optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child took approximately 6 years each. The third optional protocol took 2 years. Once adopted, however, new international law can accelerate far-reaching changes in national law, policy, and practice. I'll give you just one example. In the decade following the adoption of that optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child that I mentioned about the age when a country could send someone to fight in a war, in the decade after that went into force, at least 20 countries adopted or amended their own national legislation to raise their minimum age of recruitment into their armed forces to at least 18 years old. And this ability of new international law to create changes in domestic law and changes in domestic policy is in part because clearly articulated rights in international law can become a tool for parents when they're banging on the front door of the schoolhouse, demanding that their children are entitled to enter for free. It's a tool for lawyers when they go into court and want to convince a judge that this is the law. And it's a tool that advocates for children, like yourselves, and for civil society organizations to use to pressure your governments to deliver better for children. We also think that a new treaty is achievable and feasible. Here's why. Based on research that we at Human Rights Watch have done, we believe that about half of all countries already guarantee children 1 or more years of free pre-primary education. And at least 120 countries already guarantee free secondary education for their children. So that means that there's a large group of countries that would be ready to sign a new treaty on day 1 if they wanted to. And in fact, all countries have already made a political commitment, which is more like a promise rather than a legally binding commitment. But all countries have made a political promise to guarantee both access to pre-primary education and free secondary education as part of these sustainable development goals, which many of you will be very familiar with. So a new treaty would just give countries the opportunity to back up these commitments with binding international law. We would be basically holding countries to their word. And finally, we've been beginning to see some countries express interest in this idea, but I'm going to leave that to Joe to talk a little bit more about later. But this is important because ultimately it's countries, or I guess to be more precise, it's governments that make new international law. They're the ones who have to agree to make a new treaty and draft the language of a new treaty and agree to bring that new treaty into force. But it's us in civil society who also have an important role here in encouraging and urging governments to take this action. Governments need to hear from us that this is worth doing. So to conclude and to keep it simple, it isn't easy to create new human rights treaties. But in this case, we think that it can be done. And since it would benefit millions of children, we think that it is more than worth the effort that would be required. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete, for really setting the tone of why we're here and for civil society to understand the importance of joining this call to this initiative so that we really are able to hold our countries to account and for them to really join this treaty so that we can set a clear set of obligations for our states to protect the most vulnerable of our societies, which is children, by ensuring that their human rights are protected. My next speaker is Mercedes. Mercedes is from OMEP and she's also a GCE board member. Mercedes.
Hello, good morning. Happy to see you all and to share this moment with you, with Joe, with Bid, with Punsa, and with all the colleagues. I see some colleagues from our OMED community from Mexico, Argentina, France, Japan. So I am so happy. Well, as you know, in the world, there are nearly 1 billion children under the age of 8 years old. Nowadays, available data tell us that there are 175 million young children who do not have access to 1 year of preschool education before primary school. So globally, 75% of children are enrolled in pre-primary education 1 year before the official primary entry, but the adjusted net enrollment rate is in half low incomes and countries are the half, sorry, in low income countries than in the high income countries. So this data is very worrying, but the situation is even more serious because we do not know enough about what happens to children access to early childhood education and care during the first 5 years of life, but we know that the majority do not have access to quality ECC settings. If we analyze the provision of ECC, we can appreciate that access is determined by the economic level of families because the provision is highly privatized. So the human right of education for young children is really a privilege of a group and not a human right for all. We are all aware that the strong participation of non-state actors in the provision of ECC and this situation stresses inequalities from the beginning of life and evidenced injustice in access to the right to education of young children. There is certainly a deep debt in relation with early childhood human rights. On SDG 4, you remember that states had undertaken to ensure inclusive, equitable, and quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And in Target 4.2, states should ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development care, pre-primary education, so that they are ready for primary education. But educational systems and ECCE public policies are facing multiple challenges and serious difficulties to make effective this commitment to inclusive, equitable, and quality education for all, because they are fragmented, they are unequal, and they are diverse. And it is necessary for states to define clearest legal framework and criteria for the transformation of ECC policies and systems in various areas in order to protect and promote the right to education, reaffirming the human right from birth, and also addressing governance, regulation for public and private institutions, funding, educational programs, participation of families, children, and communities, infrastructure and equipment, and of course, working conditions, staffing and training of teachers, of educators. This is one of the dimensions of quality, very important to be addressed in a new legal framework. What is OMEP doing to transform this situation? Well, we are working with all these amazing foundations and organizations, civil society organizations, as Human Rights Watch, as Right to Education Initiative, with UNESCO, with the Global Campaign of Education, with many other activist and human rights activist. And during the last years, we were working to promote transformative efforts in public policies so that the global commitments can be met, focusing youngest children. OMEP has intensified its political advocacy action, raising the urgent need to work with multiple actors and stakeholders so that state can guarantee the universal right to an inclusive quality education assured by adequate and sustainable financing. One of the initiatives that we participated was the Global Partnership Strategy, GPS, founded in 2021 to foster political initiatives and galvanize action, collective action under the leadership of UNESCO, with some ministers of education, of selected countries, agencies, specialists, and of course, civil society organizations. And one of the challenges that were recognized is that international conventions have not been fully implemented, and the right to ECC need better legal recognition in policies and other legal framework. States lack this binding obligation. Binding obligations for us it's something that is a key, no? Binding obligation for states would constitute a critical protective measure for children. The development of an international normative framework to further clarify the scope and extent of ECC under international human rights law and related states' obligation is needed. At the national level, ECC policies and other legal frameworks are required to implement international rights and goals. And of course, all these frameworks need to be really strengthened. And because of that, inside this, the GPS, the strategic priority 4.1 was defined as strengthen international and national normative frameworks for ECC to ensure universal access to quality and inclusive ECC. The past year, following this work, the past year we all participated inside the framework of the Transforming Education Summit, and inside this, it was organized the World Conference on Early Childhood Education in Tuskegee. And inside it, we advocate a lot, and we were present in many activities. And this international meeting was category 2, so it was very important because the governments were there. And it was aimed to reaffirm the right of all children to quality ECC from birth to 8 years of age, and of course to renew all the commitments to invest in Target 4.2. UNESCO was there with all the key organizations of the UN and UNICEF, the World Bank, etc., and of course crossed by multiple tensions because we do not understand the same connected to early childhood education and care and human rights. As a world president, I was part of the drafting committee of the Tashkent Declaration, and it was very interesting because we pushed and to renew and to strengthen the commitments and political action to transform ECC. The declaration puts inclusive and quality ECC back on the agenda as a fundamental tool for comprehensive development, lifelong learning, gender equality, social equity, and sustainable development, and where all children have the opportunity to develop their full potential. The guideline principles are very interesting, and I hope you can read it in depth. I should mention that some strategies, the four main strategies are equitable and inclusive quality ECCE services, ECCE personnel, innovation and advancing transformation, and politics and governance and finance. Inside this area, politics, governance, and finance, the commitments include enhancing political legal frameworks to ensure that the right to education includes ECCE. But we couldn't push the idea of binding obligations. Yes, to express clearly that we need binding obligation for states. If we want to reduce inequality, it is central to ensure free, universal access, creating a variety of institutional formats and programs that can guarantee the principles of integrality and intersectorality of early childhood education and care. Advocating for a clear legal framework can help to regulate and provide real protection to the universal right to quality education and care, strengthening governance and regulating private provision. And the last initiative is that it is present in the GPS and we are pushing now is also the declaration inside the United Nations of a decade for early childhood, including, of course, and we are advocating, of course, for the construction of a new legal framework. And of course, the new legal framework will develop in national legal framework and public policies to guarantee, promote, and protect the human right to education for all since birth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mercedes. This initiative, as Mercedes just given a background additionally, is not only a legal construction process, but it also requires an adoption of political discussions and negotiations in which all state parties of the Conventions on the Rights of the Child should participate and ideally support. And that's why we're here and have to discuss how we lobby each other and find incidence actions that can sooner or rather than later influence the will of the rulers. My next speaker is Joe, who will basically be taking us through the opportunities for engagement.
Thank you very much, Fumza, and it's a real pleasure to join you all today. I wish you a good morning, good afternoon. It's also a real pleasure for Human Rights Watch to partner with GCE as a really important partner in pushing this new initiative for strengthening international law to allow all children to access free education at all levels. So I'm going to update you a little bit on our advocacy efforts so far, where we are, and then especially how we hope that GCE members might be able to be involved going forward. Bede mentioned, our thinking on why we believe an optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child might be a good option for strengthening international law. When we first began thinking about this idea, we, of course, wanted to know what international experts thought. And so about a year and a half ago, we began reaching out to international experts, including current and former members of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. We spoke with UNESCO, UNICEF, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. One of the first people that we reached out to was Werner Munoz. And of course, he's not only the Director of Policy and Advocacy for GCE, he's also a former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education. And we were really encouraged by his immediate and enthusiastic support for this idea. Likewise, other international experts also shared our view that it was time to update existing international law and strengthen our international legal framework to provide better guarantees of free pre-primary and free secondary education. But of course, in the end, it is up to member states, it's up to governments whether or not to negotiate new international law. So about a year ago, we started reaching out to different governments to see what they thought of the idea and whether they would be willing to engage in this process of creating new international law. So over the last year, we have spoken with almost 50 different governments from every part of the world. And in some cases, we were meeting with governments in Geneva at their missions, because Geneva, Switzerland is where the UN has its Human Rights Council and the Center of Human Rights Activities. But we also met with ministers of education at high-level events like the lead up to the Transforming Education Summit in Paris, or the conference that Mercedes mentioned in Uzbekistan on early childhood care and education in November. And here too, we have been quite encouraged that many governments respond quite positively to this initiative. They agree that it's past time to update our international law. And importantly, they see education as a positive agenda that has real potential to bring governments together. As many of you may know, during these days, many human rights issues are quite controversial at the United Nations, and they can be quite divisive. But governments see education as, in contrast, as something that can really bring people together. So our current next steps, first of all, to actually begin negotiations on a new treaty. What we need is a resolution at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. This is what's happened with the previous optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so we are hoping eventually to have a resolution at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So we are focusing our advocacy on government missions in Geneva. The next session of the Human Rights Council will start next month in June. So what we're hoping is that many of the governments that are part of the council will join in a joint statement that will highlight the importance of free education at pre-primary and secondary levels and support the idea of at least exploring new international law. Luxembourg has agreed to help lead this statement, and we're hoping that as many governments as possible will sign on to show their commitment, at least at an initial level, to this initiative going forward. The second thing is that we are hoping to form a cross-regional core group of governments from every region that will work together to champion this idea of a new optional protocol. That means joining together with joint statements, hosting events to educate other governments about the initiative, and eventually to sponsor this formal resolution. So, for example, as I mentioned, Luxembourg is quite interested. Just the other day, we were informed that Sierra Leone is willing to join this core group. Many of you know that just about 3 weeks ago, Sierra Leone adopted a far-reaching new education law that guarantees 13 years of free education, starting with 1 year free pre-primary and going all the way through 12 years of primary and secondary. So, and then we have been meeting with other governments like Thailand, like Mongolia. There are many governments in Latin America, like Chile, Costa Rica, Colombia, Brazil, that have strong laws in place that we hope might be willing to join. So let me share my screen for a moment and let's see. Okay, as Beat said, there are at least 80 countries, 85 countries around the world that already have their domestic legislation in line with our goal. So you can see this list that it includes governments from all over the world, from every region. It's certainly not just a north-south issue. So you'll see low or middle income countries, like I mentioned, Sierra Leone or Mongolia, Guyana, and others that already guarantee free pre-primary and free secondary. And then you'll see there are some wealthy countries like Norway or the United States that are missing from this list. But we think that this list shows the strong base of support or potential allies that we have. Just an explanation that the countries with a little asterisk or a cross are the countries that we've already met with, either with their Ministry of Education or their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to introduce this initiative and ask if they would be willing to take part. So when we think about how you can help with this initiative, our first suggestion is that if you have contacts or relationships with these governments and are willing to help us with targeted advocacy, reaching out to their capitals, to their ministries of education or foreign affairs, and support this initiative and ask them to join in, we would be delighted to work with you. I'm going to post in the chat in a moment the contacts for my colleague, Nevena Sekova. And if you are interested in helping with advocacy with any of these governments, you can reach out to Nevena. So the second thing is that we are creating a new working group on the right to education to focus on Geneva-based advocacy. And this will take place through a network called Child Rights Connect. Now, the Global Campaign for Education will be joining this working group as an overall entity. But if individual members are also interested in being part of this working group, to be part of more focused advocacy on this initiative for an optional protocol, we would welcome you to indicate your interest. And again, it will be Nevena's contact that is key here. So I've just put it into the chat. So you can reach out to her email if you're interested in either the working group or targeted advocacy. And she's activated her camera so she can wave and you can see who Nevena is. She just started working with us last week, but she's been based in Geneva for several years and knows the government representatives there and is already a big asset to our advocacy. And then the third way that we hope that you can help is I mentioned that we would be approaching governments to join in a joint statement at this upcoming Human Rights Council meeting in June. And as we encourage governments to join this statement, we will be sending a joint NGO letter to almost every government asking them to sign on. We will have this letter available within the next couple of weeks, and we'll ask Fumza and Werner, our friends at GCE, to circulate it to members and invite you to join on and add your logo and the name of your organization, so that when we approach missions in Geneva, they'll see that this is something that has broad support from NGOs all over the world, and it will encourage them to join this initiative. So I'm going to stop there so that we have time for questions and answers, because I'm sure many of you may have comments about the initiative or questions. And of course, we're very happy to hear them and to respond. So Fumza, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So the thing will be shared is also the template for the outreach to national governments, right?
So we have some templates, but what we think is that we want to deal with these on a one-by-one basis. So if an NGO reaches out to Nevena and expresses their interest in engaging with governments, then we can share the template and talk about how to write to the government.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to open the floor for questions or inputs on any of the panelist speakers. Is there anyone who'd like to pose a question or would like to make a comment or a point of clarity?
Hello, everyone. My name is Onyida Mola Shunola, and I'm a member of OMEP Nigeria. Mercedes has actually said a lot concerning what OMEP is doing, But then I'm just curious to find out. I looked at the list and I didn't see Nigeria there. So I'm a bit curious to know whether there was any effort made to contact the government and if maybe there was no response or what is happening. Because we know that with OMEP, we are trying seriously to get the attention of our government. However, we believe that when organizations like UNESCO, like yours, come in at a higher level, there can be some bit of response. So I'm just interested to know if there was any attempt to connect with Nigeria. Thank you.
Phumza, I can respond to this. Thank you very much for the question. As I mentioned, we've been reaching out to governments over the last year, and we've met with 50 so far. We have been prioritizing the governments that already guarantee free pre-primary and free secondary in their domestic legislation. And as you point out, Nigeria does not yet do that. We do hope to, have consultations or, meetings over time, but we have not yet reached out to the government of Nigeria.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Afternoon and good morning.
Morning.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted also to check in the case of Zimbabwe, because we are rallying towards free education because it's part of the constitution, and we're doing a lot of advocacy in that area for the Education Coalition of Zimbabwe. So I wanted to check if there was any engagement with Zimbabwe and how we can support the initiative on advocacy since it hasn't reached Zimbabwe so far.
Thank you, Joe. Do you want to answer or Bede?
Yeah, no, that's great. As I said, we're very keen to partner with any of you in approaching your national government. So if you just drop an email to Nevena, sharing your organization name and your interest in engaging the government of Zimbabwe, we will follow up with you. And we can talk about ways to reach out to both their mission in Geneva and also maybe how to reach out to officials in Harare. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There is a question on the chat box. Maybe one of the interpreters can just interpret it for us, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. The information we have is that Angola currently offers 1 year of free and compulsory pre-primary, but that it only offers 9 years of free primary and secondary education. So it does not yet offer free secondary education. So that's why it's not on the list. But again, we would be very interested in engaging with Angola. So again, please drop an email to Nevena with your contact, your organization, and we can discuss how to follow up the best. I think, as part of this process, we want to encourage governments to not only support stronger international law at the global level, but also to strengthen their own domestic laws. And as this initiative gains momentum, hopefully it will push more and more governments to look at their domestic law and consider ways to strengthen it so that they can come into line with our global goal.
Thank you, Joe. Any last questions to the panelist speakers? Okay, there seems to be nothing. Joe, Bede, Mercedes, any concluding remarks or the way forward from here?
Well, thank you, Fumza, for chairing and convening us today. Again, we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with GCE members around the world about this initiative, and are really grateful for the strong partnership with GCE as we move forward. So just to say that we will follow up through email to share additional details. We'll share the list of target countries. Again, we'll share Nevena's contact information. And also, as soon as we have it, we'll send the joint NGO letter that we'll be sending to all governments with the invitation for members to add their logos and indicate their support. So we'll do all of that follow-up by email in the next week or two. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Bede and Mercedes. It was a really good opportunity to engage you as GCE. Would like to really thank you for coming in and really engaging our members of this very important initiative. And if there's anyone within our members who's interested in also joining the Child Rights Connect working group, please connect with Nevena's contact details that were outlined on the group chat. I'd also just to conclude, I'd like to thank the interpreters as well as Sama for the tech and everyone who just spent their time to really hear. And we're really looking forward to a continued partnership with Human Rights Watch, and where we continue advocating together to protect children's rights. Thank you, everyone. So without further ado, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.